I was asked to participate in the Through My Eyes series by Lynn White, who's the series editor. Lynn has already pulled together 6 books in a series on contemporary conflict zones and the effects on children and family who live in those places. And this series is 4 books on natural disasters covering the Japanese tsunami of 2011, the Christchurch earthquake, drought in Hainan, China, and my book Angel on Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, which happened in late 2013. Lynn asked me to write this book some time ago. I've been a little busy with my work here in the United States since Donald Trump was elected, but we've been slowly pulling this book together since. And part of the reason that I was interested in doing it was because of my experience covering Typhoon Haiyan, which was a very cathartic assignment for me as a journalist when I went there after the storm in 2013. It was obviously a huge disaster. It caused basically 90% destruction of Tacloban city, which bore the full brunt of the storm. People lost their homes, their livelihoods, their families because of what was effectively a tsunami in the form of a storm surge that hit the city. So while this was a superstorm, a storm with wind gusts of more than 300 kilometres per hour, massive rainfall, about 280 millimetres in a 12-hour period. One of the big impacts from this storm that was unexpected in part by many of the people who lived in Tacloban city was that storm surge, because the central Philippines experiences these kinds of storms, not on this scale, but big typhoons every year. There's a sense of people feeling like they are prepared, that they know what to do, and they go about their routine when a storm's predicted. This one was a little different because the storm was so strong, the storm surge was so massive, it had a huge impact. And for that reason, the destruction was very great, the death toll was very high, and it's certainly something that has stayed with me for a long time. So it felt therapeutic in a way to be able to write about it through the eyes of a child, but also drawing on the conversations that I'd had with people when I was there, but also, I guess, to contribute to the history of that community by writing about something that had such an impact on them that they're still recovering from almost 5 years later. Typhoon Haiyan, as I said, was a really major assignment for me. We saw and spoke to people there who were hugely affected by what had happened. They had lost their homes, they'd lost all their belongings, their family members were dead or missing. When we arrived there a day or so after the storm, very little help had arrived. The Filipino authorities were just totally overwhelmed. It took probably almost a week for people to start getting any real help after the storm. There was a sense of shell shock as people just sort of sat on the roadside staring out at this flattened landscape, not really knowing what to do. Many things have stayed with me since covering that storm, particularly the conversations that I had with people who were looking for members of their family, whose family members had died, who were trying to contact members of their family because all communication was knocked out. There was one particular young girl who I spoke to while we were filming a story, and we interviewed her, who spoke of having to swim out of her house because this storm surge hit so quickly and was so unexpected that they literally were sort of washed out and had to push their way out through the ceiling, and then clung to a power pole for several hours with that water rushing around them and the wind and the rain. And her story really stayed with me, in part for the reason that when we came across her, she was sitting on the front veranda of her home cooking some little hotcakes, some little pancake type of things, and there was no food really available. People were just scavenging what they could from wrecked stores and perhaps picking up some supplies as they slowly were delivered by authorities. But in spite of that, as we walked in her gate and I said, "Could I talk with you?" And she said, "Yes, have you had breakfast?" And I said, "Oh no, I haven't eaten yet." And she said, "Oh, would you like some?" So people were, even though they had been through so much, they were still just being kind to each other, showing great resilience, even in those initial couple of days where, as I said, there was very little aid flowing. You could hear the sound of hammering and sawing as people picked up tools from within the rubble, and it was literally just piles of smashed buildings. It's very difficult to describe the landscape, but it really did look like an earthquake had been through. The buildings had just been completely smashed to pieces. But in spite of that, people were finding bits of damaged building and bits of wood, bits of tin, and using those to try to rebuild some shelter for themselves. So to be able to represent that in a book, to explain to kids what had happened in a world where we increasingly see these kinds of storms happening, and to try to promote some understanding of how people are affected and how the people who are affected are just like us in many ways. You know, that it doesn't matter what country they're from, or that it might feel distant from where you live. Their needs and desires are exactly the same. And Angel is just a 13-year-old girl who goes to school and loves her family and just wants to get on with her life, and her life is just thrown into complete disarray by the storm. So from that perspective, it was a book that I was happy to write. So all of the characters are really based loosely around people who I spoke to during the storm. Obviously it's a fiction book, but many of the aspects of the book are based in real things that I witnessed, real places that I went. The geography of the city as it's described, the main landmarks, are all real places in Tacloban city. The Santo Nino Church is somewhere that we went and filmed. There was a list of missing and dead pinned onto the back wall of the church, and people were coming in and out adding names of missing, perhaps crossing them off when the person's body was either found or when they managed to locate their family member. People were coming to that church for comfort from the local priest. He, for example, and this is something that is included in the book, organised for a generator to be flown over from Cebu in order to give people the capacity to charge their mobile phones, because although for many days communications were knocked out, the other issue was that there was no power on and there was no fuel really for generators. So this was something that had to be provided by authorities. It was difficult for people to find that for themselves. So those sorts of locations, the town hall where many of the aid agencies were operating from, was somewhere where we actually slept on the mayor's floor while we were working there. The big sports stadium was a shelter for people where we went and filmed. So all of those things are real. It's very much a story that is a fiction story that's couched in real events. And again, Angel's a fictional character, but in part the inspiration for that character came to me from this young girl who I spoke with, who had to swim out of her house with her family, and luckily all of her family was safe, but she told me of a family next door who had been found all hugging each other, and they had all drowned due to the storm surge. So many of those characters, the basis of the characters, the personalities of the characters come from real people that I met. We arrived about a day after the storm from our base in Bangkok. We flew on an overnight flight from Bangkok to Manila. We landed at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and our local fixer, so a local journalist who was working with us, a Filipino journalist, had organised for us to get on one of the first flights down with the Filipino Air Force. So we went to an airbase where there were dozens of media crews sort of fighting each other for a space on this plane. We were very lucky to get on it. So David, the cameraman, and myself got on the flight. They would only allow 2 of us to get on, so our fixer had to wait, come sometime later. We got on a Philippines Air Force C-130, so a big cargo plane, and the entire body of the plane is just empty space where it was filled up with food supplies, water, medical supplies. They parked a car in the middle of the plane because the majority of the cars in Tacloban City were washed away by the storm. As we took off, probably at about 6 a.m. in the morning, by then, perhaps a little earlier, we all had to push against the car to stop it from rolling down the plane. And we were literally standing room only on the plane. There were people, women, who were allowed to sit on the ramp at the back of the plane, but everyone else was standing up for the duration of the flight, which was about 2 hours. And then we landed at Tacloban City Airport, and it was completely devastated. The storm surge had washed straight in off the straight over the airport. The airport was full of essentially mud, inches thick mud. The roof was broken. Much of the airport had been completely smashed. So we arrived and we had to try and find a place to put our television equipment because it was pouring with rain. So we just sort of found a spot under a part of undamaged roof of the airport, and then we walked around dragging in bits of tin and bits of wood to use as a kind of platform to put all of our equipment on. And we slept there at the airport in some little pop-up dome tents that first night with a whole lot of refugees from the storm. So as the day went on, people started coming to the airport in the hope that they could get on a flight out. The conditions were incredibly challenging. It was raining throughout that time. As I said, there was mud everywhere, no electricity, no water, no food, no operational phones. I had a satellite phone, and I was able to use that to talk to our foreign desk to file some of my stories. But that also became quite difficult because people were asking me if they could use the phone to try to contact their family members. And I had no way of charging the phone, so I couldn't give it to people to use. It's also very expensive to use a satellite phone, obviously. So I started taking phone numbers of family members who lived in other countries and email addresses, and when my husband called me on the satellite phone, I would give those details to him. So he was then calling people's relatives saying, oh, this might sound a little strange. My wife's in Tacloban City, she met your brother or sister or whatever, and they want you to know that they're safe, but they've lost their home, they need help. So it was very challenging. There was a lot of death. So that's something that's difficult to work around when you're trying to work in an environment where many people have been killed. The cleanup effort was very slow. Again, no operational services, and just the ramp up of that aid effort was sort of frustratingly stuck for many days, and there were a lot of really desperate people. So it is really challenging, but it's obviously also important. So much as it was difficult and arduous for us, there's that constant understanding or knowledge that the people who've been hit by the storm are in a much worse position than we are, and to get their story out, which then enables them to get help by getting them attention, is meaningful. I think in the world that we live in right now, this series is particularly timely. We see increasingly these sorts of large-scale storms, for one thing. Whatever your views about climate change, it seems that these kinds of weather events are becoming larger scale and more unpredictable. So there's that. There's also the fact that young kids are much more exposed now to news because we live in a 24/7 media environment. There's obviously blanket coverage on the internet as well as television. And so I think limiting that exposure for kids is more difficult than it was when I was growing up, for example. So from that perspective, I think it's important to promote understanding among those kids about the sorts of situations that people face, the fact that while there might be cultural differences and language differences and those sorts of things, we're essentially all the same. We all have very similar needs as humans, and therefore a book like Angel, which is told through the eyes of a 13-year-old girl, enables Australian kids to relate to her and to realise, well, she's not so different to me. Her feelings about what's happening are not any different to how mine would be in the same situation. So from that perspective, there's an ability to promote connectedness and empathy among people, which I think in this sort of interconnected world that we have with a lot of challenges around things like immigration and our changing environment, that's important. But also it is an opportunity to be able to write a story about what happened in Tacloban City, and that's almost 5 years ago now. A community that's still recovering from this. So it is a way of paying tribute to the people of Tacloban City, who I found incredibly strong and resilient, and Filipinos generally very strong and resilient while I was covering this storm, and they're hugely impressive. So it's nice to be able to showcase that, but also, for the sake of history, to be able to put down on paper what happened in order to promote understanding among people. So from that perspective, it was a very fulfilling book to write.